Welcome from the Old Library in St Mary's University College on the Falls Road in Belfast. We're here today for Seminar 3 of the Teaching Profession Project. Today we're going to be discussing teacher professional learning in Northern Ireland, and in particular we'll be discussing a document which outlines and details and gives more information around this particular area and develops on from the Learning Leader Strategy. Sitting around the table today, we have a panel who will be engaged in the conversation. On my left, we have Dominic Friars, and Dominic is a primary school teacher in North Belfast. He is a graduate from Queen's University in music and is also a part-time master's student at the college here today. Martin Hagan is a lecturer who many of you will know. He's with the college here as the head of education. And before that, Martin worked for Stramillis University College as well. He's very, very experienced in the area of undergraduate and postgraduate teacher training. And in addition, Martin also has been heavily involved in the development of this work. And finally, we have Geri Cameron, and Geri is a very experienced principal. I'm not sure I should say this, but over 30 years experience. And Geri also is involved as a president or a former president of the National Association of Head Teachers. Geri is also very, very passionate about this area of developing people and the area of teacher professional learning. So that's our panel today. To begin our seminar, I'm going to hand over now to Martin, who will talk us through the document.
Thanks very much, John. So the Teacher Professional Learning document, essentially there are 4 sections to it. And the first one is the Teacher Professional Learning Framework. This emerged from research which was conducted under the auspices of USET, the University's College for the Education of Teachers in Northern Ireland. And USET funded this work, and it involved a scoping review of literature, international literature on teacher professional learning. And that was then synthesised into what we now call the Professional Learning Framework. And the Professional Learning Framework has 3 elements to it, or 3 parts to it. And we've named them as choice, continuity, and collaboration. So these are really representative of the key principles which we want to underpin teacher professional learning in this region. So choice is about the balance between teachers themselves making choices and decisions about what they need to do, and the balance between that and accountability to the system, to the children, to the communities and the schools that they work in. Secondly then is the issue of continuity, and one of the ongoing problems that we've had in our education system is the disconnect between initial teacher education, early professional development, and then continuing professional development. And the idea behind this is that a good, well-functioning teacher education system is underpinned by continuity and linkages between the different phases of a teacher's career. And then the third element of the framework relates to collaboration. And again, all of the international literature on teacher professional learning would point to the fact that teachers learn more effectively when they work together and in communities of practice and that sort of idea. So that's the basic principles then which the research has pointed us in the direction of. So that was the first phase, and that's outlined in the first section of the document. The second section of the document is really the core of it, and it's what we are calling the leadership lens, the learning leadership lens. And for the learning leadership lens, there are 5 different components or 5 different elements of that. You'll note from the design here that it looks like an eye, and that's intentional, because the eye is there because it's through that we examine professional learning in the region. So the lens, as I say, has 5 different components, and the central and first component that we look at is the core values. And again, all of the literature on good practice in education points to the need for a very clear articulation of purpose. And that purpose comes through the values. So why are we doing this work? Why are teachers doing the work that they do in the way that they do it and where they do it and so on? So the core values are commitment, respect, integrity, equality and service. And everything that we do at an individual personal level and at a systemic level must be based on those core values. The second aspect of the lens then is what we're calling the domains of practice. And in the development of this model, what we tried to do was to really focus down on the basic work that teachers do, the basic things that they do. And we came up with this framework of leading ethos, leading learning, and then leading improvement. And that might seem to be quite broad in a sense, that teachers only do three things, but within each of those three areas, those domains of practice, if you really think about it, everything in the work that we do is implicit within there. So that the ethos is central, emerging from the values. Emerging from the ethos comes the practice, the learning, the leading, and the improvement. The next element then is the actual competences themselves. And the competences, again, are emerging from the domains of practice. Now, the General Teaching Council for Northern Ireland, the existing competence framework has 27 different competences within it. But again, we felt it was important to try and make those competences much more accessible to the profession and easier to see ourselves within, in a sense. So we have basically distilled it down to 4 broad areas of competence, which are applying knowledge and understanding, working with others, solving problems, and communicating effectively. So again, if we really begin to analyse the work that we do as teachers, we can hopefully place ourselves within those broad areas. And then within each of the 4 areas, there are 3 competences themselves, or competence descriptors themselves. And these are statements of what we do, but there's also a purpose statement to accompany them, which describes the reason why we do this. And this is much more, I think, much more productive in terms of analysing our work and thinking about our profession and thinking about how we improve and develop, because we have to keep asking ourselves the question, why? Why are we doing this? And why are we doing it in this way? So those are the competence statements. So again, as I say, there are 4 broad areas, 3 competences within each, giving a total of 12, which is a big reduction from the existing 27. And then the next element of the lens is what we are calling the professional mission of the teacher and the strategic vision of the system. And again, it's back to this question, the professional mission of the teacher. Why are we doing the work that we do? And teachers have to be able to think about and to articulate and to reflect upon the work that they do and the reasons why. And it's all for the betterment of children, schools, communities and society. And allied to that then is the strategic vision. So the work of the teacher has to, if we think of it like a jigsaw piece in the big puzzle, it's part of the big puzzle of the strategic vision of where we want to take our education system in this region. And then the final element of the lens is what we're calling the learning leadership continuum. And the continuum is there to indicate how a teacher's career will develop and progress. So there are 3 aspects to this. Again, the first is learning leaders. So this whole approach adopts the principle as a key principle that a teacher from the very first day of their practice in a classroom is a learning leader. They are a leader of the children in their classroom and they are leading the learning process for those children. So leadership is not the domain only of the principal or the vice principal of the school, it's the domain of everybody. So there are learning leaders, we're all learning leaders in the first instance. Middle learning leaders then, that's taking it a step further, and that's the idea where someone has developed to a sufficient point in their practice where they're able to share that practice and share their knowledge and understanding with others. And that might be more junior members of the school community, it might be with parents, it might be with the education authority, or whatever it might be. So middle learning leaders are people who will be engaged in work which is beyond that simply of their own classroom teaching and learning leading in their own classes. And then by nature of the job and the work that they do, senior school leaders would be senior learning leaders because of the breadth of the responsibility that they have and everything inherent within that. So the idea of the continuum is that all teachers, no matter who they are, where they're practicing, whatever context they're in, whatever stage in their development they're at, should be able to see themselves somewhere along the continuum of the learning leadership lens. So those are the 5 different elements which comprise the lens. It looks relatively simple perhaps, but there's a lot behind it, and it is actually quite complex when we begin to try and unpack it. And then the third element of the lens asks the question basically, who's this for? And who can use this, and what's the purpose of it? So we're suggesting that obviously in the first instance the lens is for teachers to reflect upon their work and look at the areas where they have strength and areas where they need to improve. It's for schools in terms of developing school development plans, possibly down the line looking at issues around PRSD and so on, so there can be value to schools. It's obviously value to teacher educators in terms of the design of programs, both at initial teacher education and CPD, that those programs should be reflective of the concepts inherent in the lens. And then finally for employers. So employers can use this framework in terms of developing recruitment plans for new teachers and so on. So those are the stakeholder groups that we would suggest that the lens is for. And then finally is the evaluation. So how is all of this to be evaluated? And we're looking in terms of the evaluation to the teacher themselves. How is whatever work they're doing, whatever CPD they're doing, how is it improving their practice? We're looking at any provision against the framework. So does the provision that teachers can avail of, does it match the principles of TPL in terms of choice, continuity and collaboration? And then finally, the overall quality of the provision in terms of the accreditation of that provision, the substance of that provision and its overall value. So in a nutshell, that's the document. So the 4 areas of the document. Key element in the centre of it is the lens and the 5 areas of that. So that's a broad sweep of what we're dealing with.
So Martin, if I'm reading this right then, basically the lens is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for sight, for vision, for seeing teacher education, teacher professional learning, as it is now. Am I right in saying that?
It is very much a metaphor. The idea of the lens is something that we look through. And so we're looking at ourselves, we're looking at our profession, we're looking at our education system, and the various different stakeholders can also examine what we do through the lens as well. So the metaphor is there, and that's what we were trying to bring out very strongly in this.
Yeah. I've read the document, and I'm very familiar with the poster, the one-page encapsulation of what's in the document, and I like it a lot. And why I like it is it's a bit like the big picture for the Northern Ireland curriculum. It manages to capture in a shorthand way basically all the various elements that exist within it. And I think you're right. Actually, I think that there's a lot of implications and complexities within the document, which I think might be worth discussing and teasing out a little bit more. Can I bring Geri and Dominic in to the conversation as well too? Any initial thoughts on what we've seen and what we've heard?
So I think it ties very nicely in with where leadership seems to be going, with the idea of flattened hierarchies and maybe a distribution of power throughout the organisation, and I think it would lend itself nicely to the idea of harnessing the energy and motivation of maybe younger members of staff. One thing that stands out for me is the implications it has for professional development. So connecting the learning done at university level to the learning done on the job, and right up through to head teacher roles. So I think it's a positive development, really. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex topic, and looking at the underpinning principles in leadership needs a good airing, because we have lots of traditional views on the time served equals a leadership position, and we need to move away from that and look at a much more competency-based approach to leadership and who is an appropriate leader at an appropriate time in a school. And I think this document does that very nicely. It encapsulates the idea of lifelong learning, that we're all in a continuum, and it's really good practice within a school and even for an individual at an individual level to look at a lens, the lens as it's developed here, and see where they are on that continuum. And for young teachers, and I'm old now, but I remember it well, looking back and maybe having coordinated a piece of work in your first year of teaching or your second year of teaching, it would have been really useful to have been able to look at something like this and look at the skills and aptitudes and competencies that I had fulfilled, and to be able to say, right, I've got that under my belt now, I can move on, I can do that again, and I can enhance that and hone it and make it better. So I think it's a really useful tool at a variety of levels, individual right through to whole school. And as a school leader, I can see how this would be very, very useful in whole school development work, which is, it's wonderful for me. It's a great tool.
Yeah, it's interesting that you both picked up this idea of continuity, this idea that the concept of learning, basically doesn't stop whenever you start teaching, that it's something that continues all the way through. And one of the things in the document that I like is the fact that things are encapsulated and they're distilled sort of right down into sort of 3 principles, 4 broad domains. We've got 5 core values. So it's you can see it and it's manageable and so on. But I want to take you into that area of the principles, the 3 principles. You can see that there are the 3 C's. We have continuity, we've got choice, and we've got collaboration. And as I say, you both sort of picked up on the whole idea of continuity. So maybe, amongst the panel today, could we maybe sort of tease that out a little bit further, these 3 key principles. So we have, as I say, continuity, we have choice, and we have collaboration. I mean, how important and how contemporary are these particular principles?
I think the thinking behind these principles, if we take choice, for example, in the first instance, we began to look at where problems were in the past, where our system was falling down in a sense, so that it could be rectified and improvements could be made. So one of the areas was the idea of teacher professional development being done to you. As a teacher, you were sent off on a course as a one-hit wonder type thing. And whether that was immediately relevant to what you're doing in your particular context was neither here nor there. It was just a course that you had to go off to. So what we're trying to do here is to say, well, actually the onus is very much on you, the teacher, in your context, to say, what do you need? So what you choose, what you need from what's available to you, rather than being, so it's a more a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down one. Similarly then with continuity, one of the big problems with our system is that some people, for example, when they finish their initial teacher education, might not get a full-time job in the first instance. They may go off and work somewhere else in a different jurisdiction, different country. So the idea of the perfect system that accommodates all teachers was never really, it never really operated properly. So the idea of continuity was trying to make links between the phases. So after initial teacher education, you weren't simply cast adrift, but there was a framework there to support you to continue to develop your practice and your professionalism as a teacher. And then similarly, the collaboration, again, as we all know, I mean, when people, great minds think alike, and what's the other phrase? Many hands make light work. So when we work together and we collaborate and learn from one another, that seemed to be, as I say, from the international research on this, that seems to be what is most effective when people work together in terms of school improvement and improvements in learning and so on. So that's the thinking behind that, John.
The collaborative element for me is, I mean, I can try to describe it, but whenever you're introducing an initiative in your school, there's a moment when everybody is galvanized to move forward in the same direction, and they see themselves as an integral part to its effectiveness. And it's difficult to describe, but it's a feeling, it's an atmosphere, it's a motivational sense in the school that collaboration brings about. And it's a very difficult concept to describe. You have to feel it, but people going into a school where there's a collaborative atmosphere and where there's a shared purpose will comment on it. And I'm delighted to say they've frequently done that in my setting, and I'm sure Dominic knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. I wanted to say, Martin, the way that it's presented, being less like a checklist is definitely a positive, because everyone's strengths and weaknesses differ, and maybe areas of interest too. And being able to pick up on this like spinning plates is maybe more positive than to go through, bit by bit. And you're at this stage of your career, so you do this and so on. I think it heightens professionalism. Then, on behalf of the teacher, there's more trust, and it's the teachers have some say in their own development rather than.
That was actually one of the big points of discussion in the development of this work and this framework. Was some people said, well, it's a wee bit too loose. It doesn't tell me what I have to do. And there are no lists of things that as a teacher in stage 1, I need to be doing this in stage, And we deliberately didn't want that, because if you put a framework like that with lots of things to do in it, you immediately exclude people, because their context may not allow for that. Their particular, where they're working may not allow for that if they're working elsewhere, for example. So this was deliberately left open so that people could actually be included into it rather than excluded from it, so that they could find themselves in it in terms of whatever work they're doing at a particular point in their career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that idea of the appropriate person to lead. There's no reason why a newly qualified teacher in a new school can't be the leader in an assembly, for example, because they are the expert on a particular given topic. And I love to visualise the impact that has on the young people, looking at someone who they will recognise as a brand new member of staff, really quite young, in some instances maybe only a few years older if they're, in sixth form or whatever. But that's a very powerful message that newly qualified teacher, that new member of staff, is leading right in front of their eyes and is showing their competence. It's a very powerful message for young people to become aspirational and think I'm not that far away from being able to do that myself. So I love that idea of choice, and that at a moment in time you can achieve so many competencies that you don't have, in the past you might have had to wait to get the opportunity to do. So that's removed in this approach.
Yeah, quite often, people will say, okay, when there's a new initiative, so what's new here? Why do we have to change here? I think what I see in aspects of certainly within the principles here is the opportunity to move away from issues that existed in the past. I think Martin has alluded there to this idea of context and this notion of one size fitting all. As we go through our careers, I think quite often we find that we sit there and as we get older, we think, I actually need something else. I need something a bit different. I need something, I'm sort of quite au fait with this. I'm quite, competent and keen with this. But the nature of the way development can be done is very much bringing everyone together. Everyone hears the same things and then everyone leaves having filled out the happy sheets or whatever else it happens to be. So there is something there about that. And like as an inspector, like where there's an expectation that the teachers differentiate for their children. Mm-hmm. I think... Yeah. I think is it not a fair notion to expect that for our own learning that there's some kind of choice, there's some kind of differentiation, and I think it's that balance as well too between things that we have to do because of a new regulation, because of a new circular, because of a new initiative, and so on and that there. But at the same time, my context might be very, very, very different, and I would have particular needs as an individual. So I can sort of see no two journeys being the same. And the other wee observation I just want to pick up on, and I think it's quite pertinent and timely, is this idea of collaboration. I know that the department is very, very keen to promote schools working, between and within, but also working together in wider communities. And it's something I think that has come to the fore with the way schools have responded to the COVID disruptions. We've seen it, very, very positively, just how well schools have cooperated and worked together. So it's this idea of trying to move away from working in silos. I'm from a generation of post-primary education where we kept things to ourselves, even within the school, so trying to find ways to encourage this seems very, very appropriate and timely. Okay, the other thing that sort of struck me within that there is that at the core of the lens is the I, and at the centre of the I are these core values. There are 5 core values. The core values are commitment, integrity, respect, service, and equality. Can I maybe just invite a wee bit of comment on this?
So, that strikes me that identity is so important, and it seems that your identity is based on your values, and to have a shared identity from the youngest member staff through to the most experienced and principal, to have some grounding that everyone agrees on, a common understanding, will help foster a sense of identity and then togetherness. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely essential actually for positive leadership.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of service I think is really important. Sometimes you can become quite engrossed in the necessity of getting to the end of a job or getting to the end of a piece of work that you want these pupils to achieve in and so on. And actually, the wider service that you're doing to children and young people and giving to the school and the community and the wider society that we're launching children into has to be based on those other core values. That you have to produce young people who are able to reason and think and be mindful of other people's views and opinions. And in a school where you're providing a service to those young people, it has to be based on those core values. And unfortunately, I think not just in this jurisdiction, but in many parts of the world, we do get bogged down on outcomes and achievements, and everything is outcome based. And actually, the journey, the process can be just as important. So to provide a service in a school where children are empowered to not just achieve, but to actually enjoy the process is phenomenal. And I think this will give teaching professionals an opportunity to allow children to behave like that in a classroom, in any kind of setting within a school where they know that if they express a view or they have a way of thinking about something, that it's all right to express it and say it. That's a service to children that is really valuable later on in life. Sometimes the piece of paper that your qualification on is an indicator of your outcomes and your achievement, but actually your education is seen in your ability to lead, your ability to, at whatever level. So it's different, qualification is different to education. And I think that's facilitated in this document.
I think the question of values is really fundamental. You'll know, John, when you're conducting inspections, the issue of ethos. And, we could talk a lot about ethos in itself. And people do talk about it, but maybe not in a way which is fully understanding of what it means or how does it come about. And I think that it begins with a clear understanding of our values. So within a given school context or in a given systemic context, we have to be clear about what the values are. And in other words, it's the purpose. Why are we doing this? From that then emerge. The ethos of a school then can be built upon those values. It's the way of operating, basically, the way of thinking about our work. And in turn then school cultures emerge from ethos, and the cultures can be ones which are very empowering cultures or ones which are the opposite, So there's a connectivity between values and ethos and culture and learning and then improvement, And so that's why the values are really at the core of this model and this approach, because if we don't get those right, we can talk about policy X and policy Y till the cows come home, but it won't work unless the values are in place.
It seems, though, it's an antidote to being systems driven and obsessed with the management side of running an organisation, and understanding actually that the stakeholders are at the centre and the children at the centre, and that is why we do what we do. Very, very important that that's in the centre, I think, of the lens.
Yeah. And you're quite right, Martin. I mean, we would pay very, very close heed to the ethos of all organisations and the context of all organisations. And I think certainly with values, I think one of the things that is very important is it's all very well having values and talking values, but there are associated behaviours that are linked to those. And I think it's important that those things are actually lived out. The idea of being a teacher, it's, for many of us, it was a vocation. It was something that basically becomes your life, as opposed to a sort of 9 to 5 sort of new delivery mode. And with that brings responsibilities. It brings professional responsibilities to develop and to improve. And again, if it's something even as just as people that. If we're going for some kind of a medical check, or we're going on a plane or whatever, we would expect the people that are looking after us, we would expect them to be as fully qualified and as fully developed as possible. Yeah, and and from those 5 values, again, you mentioned the 3 domains. So we have ethos, and we've got learning, and we have improvement. And again, our ethos, learning, improvement, are they anything there that you think is of particular note or particular relevance, or can you see them in a more interdependent way? I think Martin is.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are interdependent, but I think ethos is the foundation in a sense, and the learning and the improvement will come when the ethos is correct. Again, John, you will know from schools and why they fail very often. It's because the learning is questionable. There's a lack of improvement. And fundamentally, if you boil all that down, very often it's because there's something not quite right about the feel of the place, about the operational context in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can see it very simply when you go into a school, and I've seen this in many schools and thankfully in my own as well, but where children respect their environment because they value their environment. So, there's no litter, there's no graffiti, because that would not be a good thing to do to our school. And that permeates right through to the effort that a child puts into their learning. If there's a lack of ownership and respect for their environment and the people in it, why would that be conducive to good learning and good outcome and improvement? And I was lucky enough to go to New Zealand, and they described that as a thing called manaki, which is, it isn't a very, dropping litter in your school is not a very manaki thing to do. It's disrespectful to the environment. So that creates this ethos where we are all bound together, moving forward. Our teachers, our teaching professionals, assistants, ourselves as students, and our parents and all the supports, we're all bound together to move forward, and that creates an ethos. And I brought that back and tried to embed that in my school, and it was incredibly effective. And graffiti and litter and all that stuff that we tend to hear about in a negative sense. We associate that with a school that's just not got the right ethos, disappears. But it's a whole leadership embedding. Everybody has to lead that from the classroom right through to the principal.
Yeah, of course, everybody's involved. So, for example, to see a teacher or a classroom assistant or the principal even stoop down low to pick litter up, well, the children are more incentivised. So everybody looks after this place. This place deserves respect, and and these are our values. Yeah.
It's very powerful.
As a principal, Geri, is something you have to continually work at, is it?
Oh yeah, the ownership. I am fiercely loyal. I defend my school. I embrace it. I love it. I look after it, and I transfer that to. I will hear children saying, "Oh, Mrs. Cameron wouldn't like that being said about our school," and that is an indication to me that the ethos is right, that there's an ownership there. And I mean, I feel that about my own school, the school that I left. I do see that as an alma mater. I'm interested in it. I own it. I like to hear about it. I think, if you leave your own education, at whatever age you leave it, with positivity, whether you go into the teaching profession or not, whether you're involved with schools as a parent or, at whatever level, that positivity in terms of the ethos, the ownership, is very, very powerful. And you know, young people who have a negative experience in our education system, and sadly there are quite a few, have largely had that negative experience because of a poor ethos in the school. There hasn't been a nurturing, warm, everybody counts ethos. And you know, if you're a child in deficit, or if you're a child who's already coming from behind and isn't, you know, you're not school ready, you know, for whatever reason, you need that school to step up and make up the difference, make up the deficit, pick that up so that you're not coming from behind on a daily basis. That child will reward you forever with loyalty. And if you don't have that ethos in your school, you will not get that reward. And it's very simple, but that's leadership from the principal, but it's leadership in the classroom, it's leadership in the canteen, in the playground. You know, it's important. This is a really important value-driven document that everybody can embrace. And if I'm going to say one thing, this isn't a criticism, it isn't negative, but it needs to be owned by everyone who's involved with the teaching profession, whether you are the teacher or whether you're supporting the teacher or whether you're the go-to person, the key contact for a child. And who knows who that key contact is, but everybody needs to be able to see themselves on this continuum.
Yeah, and that sort of picks up from the oft-quoted line from learning leaders. You know, every teacher is a learning leader, working in collaboration and meaningful partnerships in the interest of children. There are 4 areas of competence. They're about applying knowledge and understanding. They're about communication. The third one is about solving problems, and the fourth one is working with others. So it's applying knowledge and understanding, working with others, communication, and solving problems. I'm particularly interested in our practitioners here today. I mean, does that sound like your working day?
I would say that having 4 broad areas, it sounds more dynamic, as I said earlier on, more dialogic, as though, you know, the leadership of the school, formal leadership teams might want the staff to go in specific directions, but the staff will be listened to. Martin had mentioned earlier on about being research-driven. I think I might remember that well, but anyway, the research-driven organisation. I think all of those 4 areas can be linked to a wealth of literature that can be mined for professional development, and having an area articulated like that without, you know, a step-by-step guide that is linked to a vast literature might help, I think, as a vehicle for more professionalism within our profession. Yep. They may have suffered recently with the lack of professionalism for different reasons. Yep.
Well, one of our aspirations for this, for the lens down the line, and hopefully it will come to fruition, is that it would become an interactive website. So you mentioned there, Dominic, you know, if you wanted to know about, you know, working with others or solving problems, there's a body of literature in all of this. So hopefully down the line, as I say, this would become an interactive website, a go-to place for teachers when they want to engage in some professional learning. And you could maybe click on the button, work with others, and that would take you into, it might take you into CPD courses, it might take you into literature, it might take you into material that would be useful if you're doing your master's degree or whatever it might be. You know, you can imagine how, what a big task that is going to be to develop that. But by the same token, could you just imagine how fantastic it would be as a resource for all teachers?
Oh, it would be phenomenal, it'd be a game changer. You know, just when Dominic was talking there, I was thinking about a teacher who perhaps is 2 or 3 years into their role in a school and has a pastoral role as well as a curricular role in the school, and the skill set that they have to employ during the working day, as you described, John. You know, they might be going from direct teaching, imparting knowledge, applying knowledge, to being a counsellor, a listener, all of that skill set. But at what point does that practitioner stop and say, you know, I have such a strong skill set here, I have something to offer in this school that I could lead on? At what point do they say that to themselves? Because the day is just a flash, a blur, and you get to 3:30 and you're into reflecting on your day, and when do you get the opportunity to do that? And I think if this was an interactive document where, you know, even if it was only once or twice a term, you could go in and say, well, actually, do you know, I've developed a skill set there that I think is worth sharing in this school setting. I think I'm going to put myself forward for that. And that's back to ethos. Is the ethos and context of the school open to that? And hopefully it would be. But look at the powerful, and you called it distributed leadership, Dominic, at the start, you know, where you can actually harness the skills and talents. Without something like this, people just go on every day performing at that really good high level, but no one acknowledges it and no one sees it. You know, as a school leader, you will have an idea in your head about a teacher who is really good, really capable, and I know I need to be using them better. I need to be giving them opportunities to develop better. But do I do it? Not always, because the day is so busy. So this is a really good stop, think, reflect, and then refocus tool. The downside of that is then you lose that person because they get a job in another school and they disappear and you have to start again. But that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. And these particular competences just come back to the whole idea of a continuum. I mean, I think, you know, maybe Geri, you could maybe help us with this one. This idea of solving problems through the career of a teacher. I'm just thinking of the problems that Dominic would solve as part of his role, and the problems that you have to solve in yours. I'm sure they're very different, but I'm sure there are common skills and common dispositions and common competences that can be applied.
Yeah, I would hope that so day to day, you know, management teams in a school, their day to day work may be very different, but you know, in my school in particular, I feel a sense of shared leadership, shared ownership, and so I think that, and it can be developed, but I think that's where we want to go, or that's certainly where I want to go, and it seems to be where this document's taking us. Seems to be where we're going in the future. But yeah, I would think that sense of common understanding is vitally important.
It's also the idea that, you know, taking us to the notion of the continuity. If you take the area of solving problems, so if I have a first year student teacher here, one of the first problems they have to solve is, how do I write a lesson plan for my very first lesson that I'm going to teach? So they have to do it. In your role as a senior leader in school, let's not talk about your problems, because I'm sure they're many and varied and ongoing. But the concept is the same. You're both solving problems. And that's where the continuum comes in, that the concept fits everywhere along the continuum, as does working with others, as does communication, and as does developing knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, and ultimately it has to be about sharing the load, because, you know, it's very easy as a school leader to fall into the trap of digging everybody's garden, as my husband would say, you know, fixing everybody's problems, and actually you become the fixer as opposed to becoming a much more systemic practitioner who's thinking, you know, in a much more broad sense. And so you can spend a lot of your day fixing, and then you create a dependency. Oh, that'll be fixed, or that'll be sorted for me. So you've got to guard against that. You've got to be an enabler and bring people together to find solutions to problems. I mean, there are things I can solve very quickly. That's a given. That's why, you know, you're in the role. But there are other times whenever you know that with a bit of time and facilitation, people will come to a solution of their own. And it's choosing the occasions whenever that's the route to go. And, you know, look, there are days all I do is, you know, figure out how I'm fixing the dinners or how I'm fixing, you know, that is the practical side of it. But whenever you have the luxury of time and you do sit back and reflect, you know, you need to enable other people to become problem solvers as well. And as I say, this document, what I really, really like about it is that it is a structure, it's a framework for people to see themselves, to see where they fit. And, you know, I'm going to just say this, there are people who do not want to lead. And, you know, you cannot force leadership on people. You can't force them to be something that they are inherently uncomfortable with. And that's okay, because they are the practitioners, they're the backbone. They want to practice in their own environment, and the extent of their leadership will be their classroom or the group of people that they collaborate with on a daily basis. But for others, sky's the limit here, and that's what I like about it. There's no trajectory, no one path. You know, you can go and stop, or you can keep going.
Geri, I can imagine this lens being very useful as a reflective tool when you're writing a school development plan. But you'd mentioned time being an issue, you know, being caught up in the other daily emergencies of leadership. How do you go about making sure that you have the time to reflect? I suppose that's a difficulty.
It is a difficulty, and you know, I'd say the past 10 years in schools with things like time budgets, you know, and I'm a great believer in people having adequate time to do the job, the core purpose of their job. But I think in most contexts, in most schools, many schools, in fact, there is a desire for the organisation to be dynamic and moving forward. And so you have to facilitate that time, you prioritise it, you have to find the time, create the time, and bring the staff with you in finding that time. Now, it's getting more and more difficult because, well, the last 2 years have demonstrated that, but it's about prioritising and just saying, you know, we have to set aside certain discussions on practicalities which will happen regardless. So having a discussion about what's the best half-term holiday dates, you know, you could have an hour's discussion on that, but actually it's going to happen. So can we just decide that and set aside, and then let's talk about, you know, when we're going to get time to collaborate on, you know, a particular element of the curriculum, or how we're going to approach, you know, getting the children's voice heard in the school. How are we going to change the way we do that? So I think it's just prioritising and enabling. You know, as I said a minute ago, you know, you can develop your leaders in your school at every level to the point where they leave you. And so you have to constantly be ready to cultivate the next level of leadership. And again, that's what I like about this. You know, the competencies, I grew up with the competencies. I think it was, yeah, I definitely was part of the pilot. It's a long time ago now, but, you know, they were a checklist. I remember going through them and going, yeah, done that. And actually it was disempowering, you know, because if you only got to 6 of them, you thought, oh, I have 21 of these still to go. You know, we've moved away from that, and that's a positive.
The other problem with the competencies, of course, was that they worked very well in initial teacher education in terms of providing a framework whereby we would develop our programs. But then there was the disconnect after that. You know, they didn't work well in early professional development. They didn't work well in terms of CPD. They were kind of forgotten about, I think, almost. Whereas this new approach, or this new model here, you would hope that teachers at all phases, and this is the idea, that all phases would see the competences as being relevant to them in terms of helping them think about and reflect upon and develop their own work.
Yeah, and I think it's about internalising and applying it to the individual and applying it to the context in which that they're employed. And certainly, you know, just the idea, even just, you know, if anyone is watching this thing, well, I'm just a teacher, I don't want to be a leader and so on. I mean, it's, you know, your daily practice, you are leading learning, you are leading children, you are leading improvement, and you're contributing to that wider improvement agenda. And I think that's worth mentioning, you know. I mean, can we sort of move towards the whole idea of the? I mean, we've spoken sort of quite positively, and you know, about our initial sort of reactions, you know, to the document and to the lens and that there. But obviously, you know, as they say, the devil's in the detail, and there's quite a lot of detail in this here. I mean, so I'm quite interested in teasing out this whole idea of the policy implications. And there would be policy implications across the system. There'd be policy implications for a teacher. There'd be policy implications for schools and for the leadership of those schools. There are policy implications for teacher education, and also there are policy implications for the Department of Education and for the arm's length bodies and that. So, any thoughts on that?
I'd written on, when Geri was speaking earlier on about the warmth of her school, I'd written that, how do we measure that, and kind of going on what I said about this seeming like an antidote, to this data-driven systems management way maybe it was in the past. What it actually means in practical terms for teachers, I don't know how you go about creating that in a school, those structures. I spoke with a school locally though that had said, the ethos and values had led them to a situation where their leadership model more or less looks like this already, and it was, they couldn't come up with a good answer for me other than they had values that were related to service, an idea of service. We were here to serve the children. That was what led to all of this. And maybe this, Martin, am I right in saying it clearly sets out what a positive leadership model looks like? Is that fair?
I'd like to think so, yeah. This is, as I say, at one level it's quite simplistic. The concepts are there, the ideas are there, and there's a graphic to show it. But there's an awful lot behind it. I think first and foremost, this is about affecting a cultural change in terms of teacher professionalism. Now, in this part of the world where we live, we are very lucky and have been, because teaching is still regarded as a good profession. It's well respected. There are no real recruitment problems for teachers in this part of the world, and that's not the case everywhere. So we're getting off to a good start in a sense already, but this is cultural change in the sense of heightening that professionalism of teachers, giving teachers the onus to make their own choices, to make their own decisions, based upon their context and who they're with and who they're working with and so on, and at their different career phases. I think that we're talking here, this is a generational change. This work is emerging out of the Learning Leaders, which was published in 2016. We're now in 2022. Okay, there's been a big blip in the middle of that period. But I think this is generational change, because you have to change people's way of thinking about things in the first instance. So that's why this model begins, as it should, in initial teacher education. So when you're fostering and nurturing young people who want to be teachers, when they graduate, they will be familiar with this and this approach and this philosophy in a sense. And at the same time, whilst that's happening there, at the same time it has to be embedded within the existing profession, existing workforce that's out there. There are financial implications to it, there's no question about that. A key aspect, for example, of the Learning Leaders strategy is the whole question of mentoring, and your entitlement as a teacher to mentorship and so on. What's that going to look like, and how is that going to be thrashed out? One of the other proposals behind this is the idea of an Eportfolio, where a teacher could be basically mapping out their career and development, and that could be used down the line for recruitment purposes and so on. Huge financial implications and big questions about who owns that and how is it monitored, and so this is only the start of a very, very, very long journey, I think, which involves very deep level systemic change in the way that we think about how we do things. And some people, I've no doubt, will not buy into it. That's just to be expected. But I do think that the feedback that we've had to this point has been very favourable, and I think this is to the advantage of the profession. This approach is to the advantage of the profession, and as such then it's to the advantage of children and schools and communities within which those teachers work.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that in society we're moving towards a position where you do not have to have served time to be able to move up the ranks, and you only have to look at the whole digital world where it's dominated by young people and young thinking and future thinking. We need to embrace that within education and see our young teachers who are coming in equipped with all of this as refreshers for those of us who have been in the system for a longer period of time. And there has to be that synergy between experience and innovation. And when you get that, and when you allow that innovative practice to embed in your school, then that innovator has to be a leader in that area. So you have to be open to that. And, I think there's lessons in that for, the authority, the outside bodies, DEA and so on, in how they approach structures, the systems and structures that govern our schools. because there will be a reluctance to allow, you know, a newly qualified teacher to lead on something in a school. That will be a leap for some schools within some contexts, and we need to, as Martin says, it's generational. I would like to think that we could get it shifted quickly within a period of time, so that, you know, we are looking at a more fluid population of educators who see themselves as enablers in one school, and they acquire a skill set, and then that skill set is better transferred to another school. I mean, Dominic, you're very young, and yet you're very experienced. You know, I would dare to say that you will move schools, that you will have a pathway that will allow you to use your skill set, and that would be embraced and not frowned upon. That would be something that, you know, we would expect. And I think education is one of those professions where there is some sort of kudos in being in the same school for 40 years. And, you know, I've been here for 40 years, I've done the same thing 40 times for 40 years. That's not necessarily a good thing. So that fluidity and that movement and that dynamism, and becoming a leader through that is to be welcomed.
Yeah, I suppose you can see with what Martin, what you're saying and what Martin's saying is, you know, is one and the same. You know, if the ethos is going to drive this idea that it's about system improvement rather than just your school and your department and your classroom. But yeah, I suppose maybe, Sean, how are the structures, and what do they look like practically, and how do we get, you know, principals in? What you said, not everybody, but how do you get principals to adopt a different leadership structure for their school, maybe formally? Yeah.
If you look at international comparisons, I mean, if we look at teacher education here and look at it in England, for example, I mean, it's worlds apart, totally worlds apart. If we look to the education system, which is branded as supposedly the best in the world, Finland, they're moving more along this kind of way of thinking. You know, that teaching is a vitally important profession. All teachers should have master's degrees. You know, teachers are given time to reflect on the work that they do with a view to developing and improving it and so on. So those key principles which are recognised as working, you know, are all implicit in this model. But the culture in Finland is very different to the culture in England. It's very different to the culture here. So we can't just take one solution from one place and impose it on another. We have to think about the nuances of what that looks like and what that means.
I think all three of you have said so far this morning that, well, you know a good school when you walk in, like the one.
And you do.
And I feel the same. That doesn't show up on, you know, on paper. Well, it might show up on paper, but you know, you have to join the dots. And so you would have to be skillful, as an inspector said, to join the dots, and maybe to be cognizant of the context. But so the structures, the work on context are going to be different then for lots of different schools, and maybe the guidance for schools is going to cost a lot of money, maybe, and certainly time, with the time budgets and the system. I mean, it's not without difficulties, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, the thing we would always say is, you know, when you went to a very effective school, you know, the ethos is dripping off the walls. You don't have to look for it. You just don't have to look for it in a bit of paper. It's there. I think for me, you know, one of the key implications across all of this, the implications it has for school leaders and teachers and ourselves and you guys at St Mary's, is just the whole idea of competing priorities. And quite often, you know, we can be very, very well intentioned. We want to do our best. We want to do all these things. And yes, I want to sign up for everything. But there are only 24 hours in a day, and there's only so many, so much time that you have. And again, in a school and that, there again, quite often, you know, teachers are incredibly busy, and they've got so many, you know, bits of their, if you like, their day-to-day job to do. That some might see this as something that is additional, as opposed to something which is integral. And that, I mean, I'm just curious to know, Geri, as a school principal and that, there, you know, competing priorities, does that resonate? Or?
Oh, absolutely, it totally does. But, you know, I spend a lot of time, and I always have, in trying to enable staff to stop worrying about the targets and outcomes and actually concentrate on the process and the practice, because generally, if you get that right, the outcomes are better. But you know, I would love to get to a point in life where you didn't have to set aside bespoke time for this type of work, that it was intrinsic, it was embedded, and you know, there was a way of thinking and being in a school where a teacher or a teaching assistant or whoever this is applying this to themselves can think this way. This is about a way of thinking, a way of being, as opposed to taking time aside and sitting down and going, right, where am I now? You know, that's the luxury end of this, where it is so intrinsic in what we do. It's a way of thinking, a way of being, and maybe this is the document to do it. I've lived through many documents in 35 years of being in post, and some of them do gather dust. Some of them are sitting up there, and every now and again I do look at them, have them all, and I've flicked through them and go, that was a really good idea, you know. And there's nothing earth-shatteringly new in the world of leadership. Good leadership is what it is at any level. But I think for the first time, this simplifies it to the point where I could be unconsciously thinking in a school as a teacher, actually that's a leadership quality. What I've just done there. You know, I'm hoping, Dominic, that you can understand what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Can I'd say, I mentioned it earlier on, but this teaching profession project, where they published the literature review on teacher wellbeing, and one of the findings was the collaboration. It just came to my head. The collaboration was refreshing for teachers, that it was actually a positive for their wellbeing, and I personally feel that. So if I meet with colleagues, maybe after school, it doesn't feel like work. And one colleague in particular, I'm thinking of, if we work in the evenings or at the weekend together, it doesn't feel like work. And it's refreshing, it's exciting, it's motivating actually. Mm-hmm. You don't need the budget for it, is what I'm trying to say. And it's hard to harness that across the entire workforce. How it must exist, obviously, you know, so.
Oh, it does. And what you have to do is you have to encourage that and discourage the opposite of that. And eventually you will get to a point where, you know, the good practice pushes out the negative practice or the poorer practice. That's aspirational, and we can never set that aside. But what you've described is something that every school desperately needs. You need people to go beyond and to do it not just for the good of the school, but for the good of themselves, for their own development. And as you say, it is refreshing. And one thing that I wanted to add in, and then I'll stop talking, but you know, we all have in schools teachers who have been there for a long period of time and who may be entrenched in a type of practice that, you know, isn't alongside the innovative practice that you would like to see going on in your school. This is a way of actually getting that teacher refreshed. I think it isn't a checklist where someone who's taught for 25 or 30 years is weary and going, you know, are you trying to teach me to suck eggs here? You know, this is a way of thinking. And this could be very, very motivational, but I don't think it's a set aside. I think it has to be embedded in the way that you live every day in your school. If you can bring everybody with you with this document, well, wow, what a bonus.
Yeah. I suppose the thing that struck me there is if we think back to the last big seminal change here, which was the curriculum, the Northern Ireland curriculum. And I'm not talking about the current one, I'm talking about the one before that.
You're showing your age now.
Exactly. But I mean, it challenged everybody's way of thinking about things. You know, as a primary school teacher at that point, I remember 10 files, one for each subject area, you know, which were jam-packed, way too packed with stuff you had to do. And then the revised curriculum as we have now, you made reference to the big picture document. It's part of the culture of teachers and teacher professionalism here. We all know it. You know, we're familiar with it. And it's embedded. And whilst there may have been arguments and challenges to, you know, the introduction of things like the world around us, for example, as opposed to distinct stuff, they've gone away and it is what it is now. And it's part of who we are and what we do. And it would be nice to think that this too could operate in the same kind of way, you know, down the line.
Yeah, the seatbelt phenomenon. You know, you get into a car, you put on your seatbelt.
That's right.
You go into your classroom, you think along these lines. You know, you think about what leadership am I going to use today in this classroom, and can I hone it and transfer it to the department, or can I take it to whole school?
I don't know whether it's an overstretch to say this, but it seems like really successful, even in the private sector, really successful companies are very loose with what foundationally they are. There's a lot of room for creativity and innovation. And sometimes when there's too much written about something, when there's too much diktats and so on, it can be overwhelming. And
yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've more or less reached the end point, and just before we finish, I think it might be worth any final observations if anyone wants to.
It's a very good document.
I suppose I would just say, I mean, there is a poster, and the intention of the poster is that it's a kind of an aid memoir. That teachers will see it, they will recognise the metaphor of the eye. It'll be something maybe that could be in every staff room, in the same way that the big picture of the curriculum is. So it's an aid memoir. It's good in that sense, but you can't really understand it unless you unpack it by going to the main document. And the main document is challenging. There's a lot in it, and it needs a lot of thought to get your head around it. The whole thing will be going out to consultation over the next number of months, and it'll be interesting to see how people react to it, and hopefully they will look to it favourably. We'll see where it goes.
Geri, any final observations?
I was just going to say that if this is the document that stimulates the profession to galvanise themselves to be what they were, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the kudos and the respect that the profession had, and many teachers would have said over the last few decades that was eroded. And if this is a document that galvanises people to feel that empowerment again, then wow, it's wonderful. I'm delighted to see it. And hopefully we are cultivating a whole new generation of leaders, and this is the way that they will lead. This is the way they will think. And I'm looking at Dominic over there because he's.
I have nothing to add.
He's definitely a leader going forward.
Well, folks, we've sort of reached the end now, and I think it's worth taking this point to thank our panellists today for their contributions. If I could sort of flag up that the next seminar in this series, the Teaching Profession Project, will be coming up very soon, and you would have to check the St Mary's website. So if you go to the St Mary's website and check for that there, you'll see when that is due. Can I thank you all for watching? Thank you.